The reservation was for 2 people, under a name that meant nothing, but the security detail that swept the restaurant 3 hours prior meant everything. At 8 o'clock, Sheikh Khalid Al-Jamil entered, and the ambient clatter of silver on porcelain in the Michelin-starred dining room seemed to fall away, absorbed by the sheer gravity of his presence. He moved with an economy of motion that bespoke a life without obstacles, his white thobe immaculate, his red and white keffiyeh perfectly draped. Behind him, an older woman, his mother, Amira, walked with a quiet dignity, her plain beige dress a whisper against the restaurant's opulent gold and velvet. The staff froze. They had been briefed. They had been drilled. And now, faced with the reality, they were useless. The manager, a man usually composed to the point of arrogance, bowed so low he might have been studying the pattern on the Persian rug. He led them to the best table, a secluded alcove overlooking the city lights. He offered water. He presented menus. He spoke in hushed, reverential tones. He did it all to the sheik. The sheik's mother, Amira, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. She had not been offered a menu. She had not been greeted. She was an elegant, silent accessory to the man who signed the checks. Clara, a 21-year-old waitress whose section was on the other side of the room, watched from behind a marble column. She saw the manager gesture effusively, explaining the chef's specials. She saw Sheikh Khalid's jaw tighten as he gave a curt nod, his eyes flicking towards his mother. And she saw what no one else did, the faint, almost invisible tremor in Amira's hand, a sign of agitation, of being erased from her own life. The manager finally took the sheik's order and backed away, sweating. Clara saw her moment. It wasn't courage, it was a reflex, an instinct honed by a different kind of love, a different kind of silence. She picked up a water pitcher and walked toward the table. Her manager hissed her name, but she ignored him. She approached not the sheik, but his mother. She met the older woman's startled eyes, offered a small, warm smile, and then, her hands moving with practiced grace, she signed 2 simple words: water or tea. Amira's eyes widened. A look of profound, heart-stopping shock crossed her features. She slowly lifted her own hand and signed back. "Dea, please." Sheikh Khalid went perfectly still. He had been watching the entire exchange, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic control. Every one of his advisors, his security, his legions of staff, had treated his mother as a fragile relic. This girl, with her cheap black uniform and worn-out shoes, had treated her like a person. The fuming manager rushed over, ready to drag Clara away. But Khalid raised a single finger, a gesture that halted the man mid-stride. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the suddenly silent room. "From now on," he said, his gaze fixed on Clara, "she is the only one who will be serving this table, for the duration of our stay in this city." It was a simple command, born of momentary frustration, but for the sheik and the waitress, it had just set the entire world off its axis. 2 weeks later, she was still there. The sheik's stay in the city had extended, and Clara's life had been rearranged by his decree. The hotel had placed her on indefinite, paid leave from her normal duties, her time now belonging entirely to the Al-Jamil suite. Her job was simple: to be present for every meal, to be the bridge between Amira's silent world and the hearing one. What none of his staff knew was that Sheikh Khalid had begun to watch her. He would sit through entire meals, feigning interest in his phone or a financial report, but his attention was fixed on the quiet interactions between Clara and his mother. He saw how Clara didn't just translate a menu, she described it. She would sign about the crispness of the sea-based skin or the creamy texture of the risotto, her hands painting pictures that a simple list of ingredients never could. He watched his mother, who for years had eaten what was placed before her with polite indifference, begin to ask questions, to express preferences, to engage with the simple pleasure of a meal. She was waking up, and Clara was the reason. One afternoon, during lunch in the private suite, Amira signed something to Clara that made the young woman laugh. It was a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed out of place in the sterile luxury of the hotel. Khalid looked up from his papers. What did she say? Clara's smile softened. She told me a story about how you used to hate mushrooms as a boy, how you would hide them in your pockets. Khalid felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He hadn't thought of that in 30 years. His mother hadn't told a story, a real memory, in his presence for at least a decade. She communicated needs, schedules, polite greetings. But this was different. This was sharing a piece of their life. He looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I didn't do anything," she replied, her gaze direct. "I just listened." What she did not realize was that he had already investigated her. A single phone call to his head of security had yielded a slim file. Clara Hayes, 21, from a small town in Ohio, working 2 jobs to pay for her community college tuition and send money back to her family. Her grandmother, deaf in her later years, had passed away 6 months ago. The information painted a picture not of ambition, but of quiet, relentless duty. There was no angle, no scheme. She was exactly who she appeared to be. This fact was, to Khalid, more unsettling than any hidden agenda. The next evening, he tested her. After a long dinner, as she was preparing to leave, he placed an envelope on the table. It was thick with cash. "A gratuity for your excellent service." Clara looked at the envelope, then at him. There was no greed in her eyes, only a flicker of something he couldn't name. Disappointment, perhaps. "I'm an employee of your office now, sir. You pay me a salary. A very generous one. This is my work." She pushed the envelope gently back across the table. "Your mother's happiness is the only tip I need." She left him sitting there, the envelope a stark white rectangle of miscalculation on the polished mahogany. Everyone in his life performed for money, for status, for favor. She performed for a sense of purpose. This was the decision he would not be able to walk back, the realization that he was intrigued not by what she did but by why she did it. His chief advisor, a shrewd, loyal man named Ferris, noticed the shift. He had served the Al-Jamil family for 40 years and knew the signs of a ruler's fixation. He found Khalid late one night on the suite's balcony, looking down at the city lights long after his mother had retired. "Your Highness," Ferris began, his voice smooth, "the girl has been a remarkable asset, a comfort to your mother." Khalid didn't turn.
"She has."
"She is a temporary convenience," Ferris continued, choosing his words with surgical precision. "A pleasant novelty. Let us not allow it to become more than that. Your family, your future, they have certain expectations." It was a gentle warning, a reminder of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between a sheik and a waitress. Khalid turned then, his eyes cold. "My mother smiled today, Ferris. A real smile. When was the last time you saw that?" He looked back at the city. "Do not speak to me of expectations. I have exceeded all of them. Perhaps it is time I considered my own." A few nights later, Clara was serving them a late dessert. Amira had retired early, and it was just Khalid in the grand, empty dining room of the suite. He was working, papers spread across the table. Clara moved with her usual quiet efficiency, placing a cup of coffee beside his hand. As she turned to leave, she glanced at him. He wasn't looking at his papers. He was watching her, his expression intense, unguarded. He had been caught. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with unspoken things. He did not look away, and in his gaze, she saw something beyond the sheik, beyond the billionaire. She saw a man, tired and lonely, sitting in a gilded cage. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and left the room. The silence she left behind louder than any words. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple. The next, a torrential downpour was lashing against the hotel's panoramic windows, turning the city into a blur of weeping lights. Roads flooded. The power grid flickered, unstable. The hotel advised all guests to remain indoors. Khalid, his mother, and Clara were in the suite's dining room, halfway through dinner. Most of the hotel staff had been sent home, leaving a skeleton crew. Clara had volunteered to stay. They were effectively stranded together, the storm outside erasing the world and shrinking their own to the dimensions of the room. The lights buzzed, flickered, and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting the opulent room in an eerie, dim glow. The shadows grew long and distorted. Khalid's usual composure seemed to fray at the edges. He stared out the window at the rain, which his mother, seated calmly, could not hear. "She always loved the rain," he said, his voice quiet, directed at Clara more than himself. "My father, he did not. He said it was an inconvenience, that it disrupted schedules." He let out a short, bitter laugh. Everything was a transaction to him. He looked tired, the mask of absolute control slipping. The carefully constructed artifice of his life was being washed away by the storm. He turned from the window and asked her a question that seemed to come from a place of deep, unhealed pain. "Do you believe a person can build an entire world for someone and still fail to give them the one thing they need?" Clara looked at him, then at Amira, who was watching the lightning with a serene expression. She didn't offer a comforting lie. She didn't give him the polite deference he was used to. She gave him the truth. "You can't give someone a world," she said, her voice steady in the quiet room. "You can only share yours. The real one. The one where it rains and things are messy and the power goes out." She took a small step closer. "You built her a silent palace, but she already lived in a silent world. Maybe she just wanted a window someone would look through with her." Her words landed with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever dared to speak to him with such unvarnished honesty. He saw his life's work laid bare, a monumental, breathtakingly expensive, and ultimately hollow gesture. "My father," he began, the confession spilling out of him as if a dam had broken, "was a powerful man, a loud man. Her deafness, to him, was an imperfection, a flaw in the family name." He ignored it. He spoke around her, over her. As if she wasn't there, he paced the room, the shadows clinging to him. "So, I did the opposite. I built a world for her that needed no sound. The best staff, the most beautiful things, a life so perfectly managed she would never have to ask for anything. I tried to protect her from the judgment, from the inconvenience." He stopped, his back to her. "But I built her a cage. A beautiful, gilded cage. I isolated her just as much as he did, only my methods were kinder." His wound was finally exposed. The terrible fear that he was, in the end, no different from the father he despised. He had simply replaced neglect with control. Clara felt a profound ache of recognition. His story was a mirror of her own, magnified by wealth and status. "My grandmother," she said softly. "After she lost her hearing, my family thought the answer was volume. They just shouted at her. When that didn't work, they just stopped. It was easier to talk around her. For the last few years of her life, I was the only person who learned to sign. I was the only real conversation she had." She met his eyes across the shadowed room. "When she died, my biggest regret wasn't that she was gone. It was that I had let our family make her so lonely. I know what it's like to watch someone you love be treated like a beautiful, fragile object that no one knows how to hold. Loss answered loss. Isolation understood isolation." He walked over to the window where she stood, the storm a chaotic ballet outside. They stood side by side, the space between them electric. His mother was dozing now in her chair, a picture of peace amidst the turmoil. He looked at Clara, at the strength in her quiet posture, at the wisdom in her young eyes. He saw not a waitress, not an employee, but the only person who had ever truly seen the nature of his failure and had not judged him for it. He lifted a hand, the impulse to reach out, to bridge that final gap, overwhelming him. But decades of training, of reserve, of being a sheik, took over. His hand fell back to his side. He stepped back, the mask of formality clicking back into place. "The storm appears to be passing," he said, his voice once again controlled. "I will have my security see you home safely." He had pulled back, but the crack in the facade remained. The next morning, Ferris approached Clara in the hotel lobby. His expression was one of professional neutrality, but his eyes held a new, grudging respect. "The sheik has requested you act as his mother's personal liaison for the remainder of their trip," he announced. Not just for meals. For her appointments, her excursions, her shopping. Your employment with the hotel will be suspended. You'll be compensated directly by his office at a rate of 10 times your current salary. He was not offering her a gift. He was not asking her on a date. He was placing his most precious person, his mother, entirely in her hands. In front of his staff, his security, and his world, he was making a public gesture of absolute trust. It was more intimate than any declaration of love. The arrival of Sheikha Latifah, Khalid's older sister, was as subtle as a thunderclap. She flew in from Riyadh on her private jet, unannounced, summoned by a worried message from Faris about her brother's unusual fixation. Latifah was a woman forged in the crucible of power and tradition. She saw the world in terms of assets, liabilities, and strategic alliances. Clara Hayes was, in her cold assessment, a liability. She summoned Clara not to a grand drawing room, but to a sterile, anonymous business suite on a different floor. The message was clear. This was a transaction, not a social call. Latifah was elegant, her jewelry understated, but worth more than the entire building they were in. "Miss Hayes," she began, her voice smooth and polished as marble. "My brother is a man of deep sentiment. He feels a great debt to you for the kindness you have shown our mother." "It's my job," Clara said simply, refusing to be intimidated. "And my pleasure." Latifah smiled, a brief, cold curving of her lips. "Of course. And such dedication should be rewarded." She gestured to a folder on the table between them. "I have taken the liberty of arranging some options for you. A full scholarship to any university in the world. A seed fund to start any business you desire. A new life, a fresh start, anywhere you choose. All you have to do is choose it." It was not a clumsy bribe with a check. It was a sophisticated, surgical removal of a problem. The offer was life-changing, a golden key to a future Clara could only dream of. There was only one condition, unspoken but hanging in the air between them. "Disappear." "My brother," Latifah continued, pressing her advantage, "confuses gratitude with something more. It is a noble flaw, but a flaw nonetheless. You are a kind girl, a smart girl. Do not let his sentimentality ruin your life, or complicate ours. Take the gift. Build a future for yourself. Leave us to ours." Clara listened, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt no anger, only a profound clarity. She thought of Amira's smile. She thought of Khalid's haunted eyes in the storm. She was not a complication. She was a connection. And that was something Latifah, with all her power, could never understand. "Thank you for the offer, Your Highness," Clara said, her voice even and calm. "It's more generous than I could ever imagine." Latifah's expression relaxed almost imperceptibly. She thought she had won. "But I was hired to do a job," Clara continued, "and I haven't finished it. Your mother has a visit to the art museum scheduled for this afternoon. I should go and make sure the arrangements are in order." She stood up. "If you'll excuse me." She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had simply refused to be bought, refused to be erased. She chose her small, quiet duty over a fortune. She walked out of the room, leaving Sheikha Latifah sitting in stunned, furious silence. Clara didn't run to Khalid. She didn't tell him what had happened. She went to the museum. Khalid found out anyway. Faris, his conscience finally outweighing his loyalty to tradition, confessed the details of Latifah's plan. A cold fury, unlike anything he had felt in years, settled over Khalid. He found them in the modern art wing. His sister stood near the entrance, a silent sentinel of disapproval. Across the gallery, bathed in the soft light from a skylight, were Clara and his mother. They were standing before a large, abstract canvas of swirling blues and golds. Clara's hands were moving, not translating a curator's notes, but describing the feeling of the painting, the motion, the emotion. And his mother was rapt, her eyes alive with understanding. This was the scene his sister had tried to destroy. He walked past Latifah without a word, his focus entirely on the two women at the center of the room. As he approached, they turned. He saw the question in Clara's eyes, the wariness. He saw the placid curiosity in his mother's. He ignored his sister's sharp intake of breath. He stopped before his mother, and then he did the one thing that would change everything. He raised his hands. Slowly, his movements clumsy and halting, he began to sign. The gestures were rough, unpracticed, but the intent was unmistakable. He signed his mother, his eyes locked on hers. "I would like you to teach me, so I can hear you better." It was a public confession. In front of his formidable sister, his security, and the hushed museum patrons, he was admitting a lifetime of failure. He was relinquishing control. He was not rescuing Clara. He was joining her. He was choosing her way, the way of connection, over his family's way of silence and isolation. It was a surrender. It was a victory. Amira looked at her son's fumbling hands, then at Clara's steady ones beside her. A lifetime of quiet observation, of knowing the hearts of her family better than they knew themselves, culminated in this one moment. She turned to Khalid, but her wise, knowing eyes were fixed on Clara. She signed, her movements fluid and certain, a message for her son that was also a validation for the young woman who had changed their world. "For 30 years, you gave me quiet." She, Amira gestured toward Clara, gave me a voice. Weeks later, the fine dining restaurant where it all began was closed to the public. A single table was set in the secluded alcove overlooking the city lights. There were 3 place settings. Khalid sat across from his mother, their hands moving in a slow, patient conversation. He was still learning, but the effort, the willingness was everything. Clara sat with them, no longer an employee, but a guest, an equal. He paused in his conversation with his mother and caught Clara's eye. A warm smile touched his lips. He lifted his hands and, with a fluency that was growing each day, signed a simple question across the table to her. "Are you happy?" She smiled back, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face, and nodded. He had spent a fortune building a world of perfect silence for his mother, only to discover that the greatest luxury he could ever give her was a simple conversation, bought and paid for with the courage of a waitress who knew that listening is something you do with your eyes.